The briefing room fell silent when the radar operator's hand stopped mid-gesture above the tactical display. His finger trembled slightly as it hovered over a blip that shouldn't exist. Outside, dawn painted the Afghan mountains in shades of copper and ash, but inside Forward Operating Base Nightingale, every eye fixed on the impossible signature climbing through 20,000 feet. The operator's voice cracked when he finally spoke. Viper 7-1 is still airborne. Major Katsaros leaned forward, his weathered face catching the green glow of the monitors. He'd flown combat missions over 3 continents, survived 2 ejections, and put enough hours in the cockpit to qualify as a migratory bird. Nothing surprised him anymore. Nothing should surprise him, but this did. He replayed the footage frame by frame. The A-10 Thunderbolt had taken a direct hit from a surface-to-air missile at 12,000 feet, the explosion ripping through the left engine in a blossom of orange fire that consumed the entire tail section. Standard protocol demanded immediate ejection. The book said so. Physics said so. Every instinct honed over 3 decades of military aviation said so. Yet the aircraft had rolled inverted, dropped into a spin that should have torn it apart, and disappeared into a canyon so narrow the drone operator lost visual. That was 4 minutes ago. 4 minutes in which command assumed they were coordinating a search and rescue for whatever remained of the pilot. 4 minutes in which the major had already begun drafting the casualty notification. Now the impossible aircraft was climbing, single engine, streaming fuel and hydraulic fluid, but climbing. "Get me a visual," Katsaros ordered. The drone operator's fingers danced across his keyboard, redirecting the Reaper's camera. The image flickered, resolved, and there it was. It looked like it had been chewed by something ancient and angry. The left engine was gone, just a blackened cavity trailing smoke. The vertical stabilizer hung at an obscene angle. Part of the left wing was simply missing, as if a giant had taken a bite. But it flew. The radio crackled with a voice so calm it bordered on conversational. "Nightingale Control, Viper 7-1. Single engine, multiple systems degraded, but I've got approximately 30 minutes of fuel and most of my flight controls. Requesting priority vectors for emergency landing." The major recognized that voice. He'd heard it in a dozen briefings, always asking the technical questions the hotshots ignored, always staying late to review mission tapes. The voice belonged to Captain Myra Kovach, and suddenly her call sign made terrible, perfect sense. The major had authorized it himself 6 months ago, had even laughed at the irony. Viper, the snake that strikes from unexpected angles. He hadn't known how literal it would become. "Viper 7-1, this is Nightingale Control," Katsaros replied, his own voice steady despite the ice spreading through his chest. "Understand single engine, multiple failures. Be advised you are cleared priority for immediate landing. All traffic is holding." He paused, glancing at the meteorological display. The numbers there weren't kind. Winds are 15 knots gusting to 25, visibility down to 3 miles in dust. "Can you make the approach?" The silence stretched for 3 heartbeats. Somewhere in that broken aircraft, threading through mountains with half an airplane, Captain Kovach was calculating angles of descent, fuel consumption rates, the structural integrity of damaged control surfaces. Mathematics written in fire and altitude. "Affirm, Control. I'll be there in 12 minutes. Viper 7-1 continuing approach." The major looked at his senior controller, a master sergeant who'd been directing aircraft since before Kovach was born. The sergeant's expression said what regulations prevented him from speaking aloud. No one survives that kind of damage. No one makes a controlled approach with those systems degraded. No one stays that calm when their aircraft is actively disintegrating around them. But the blip on the radar continued its steady descent, and the major found himself doing something he hadn't done since his first combat deployment 28 years ago. He prayed. The air traffic controller keyed his microphone again, this time broadcasting to every aircraft in the pattern. "All stations, Nightingale Control. We have an emergency aircraft inbound, catastrophic damage, single engine. Field is closed to all traffic. Emergency equipment is rolling now." Response came immediately from a circling C-130. Nightingale, Hercules 2-3. We've got visual on Viper 7-1. Jesus Christ, she's flying on a prayer and spite. The major could hear the awe in the cargo pilot's voice. These were men who flew aluminum whales through the worst weather the planet could throw at them, who landed on dirt strips under fire, who never flinched. And they were impressed. Katsaros switched to the tower frequency. Fire crews, be advised the aircraft is trailing fuel. Foam the entire approach path. This is going to be sporty. Outside, the emergency vehicles screamed across the tarmac, their red lights strobing against the morning dust. Firefighters in silver suits positioned themselves at intervals along the runway, ready for catastrophe. The base commander arrived in the tower, still fastening his uniform jacket, his face gray. "Status," he demanded. "She's 7 minutes out, sir, flying an A-10 that shouldn't exist anymore. Left engine destroyed, partial wing loss, tail damage, and degraded controls." The major's voice was clinically precise, but his knuckles were white where he gripped the edge of the console. Probability of successful landing. The commander's question hung in the air like cordite smoke. The major glanced at his senior controller, at the meteorological officer, at the damage assessment on the screen. Every calculation pointed to the same conclusion. He should tell his commander the truth. He should recite the statistics, the structural stress tolerances, the minimum control requirements for a safe approach. Instead, he thought about the voice on the radio, that almost eerie calm, and found himself saying something that surprised him. "Sir, I've been doing this for 3 decades. I've seen pilots crack under less pressure. I've seen perfect aircraft fall out of the sky because someone panicked for 2 seconds." He paused, watching the blip descend through 5,000 feet. "That pilot hasn't wavered once. Her voice hasn't changed. She's flying that wreck like it's a training sortie. So probability," he looked his commander straight in the eye, "I'd say better than 50-50, and that's a goddamn miracle." The commander nodded slowly. "What do you need?" "Clear skis and a little luck, sir. I'll take care of the rest." The radio sparked to life again, and this time there was the faintest edge in Kovacs' voice. Not fear exactly, but acknowledgement of reality. "Nightingale, Viper 7-1, I'm getting some asymmetric yaw. It's manageable but getting worse. Requesting confirmation that approach is clear. I'd rather not go around." The implication was clear. There would be no go-around. This was one chance, one approach, one landing. After that, the aircraft would be done, fuel exhausted, the structural integrity finally surrendering to physics and flame. "Viper 7-1, approach is clear. You are number 1 and only. Winds are 270 at 18, gusting to 24. Runway 27 is yours. Fire equipment is standing by." The master sergeant pulled up the aircraft's maintenance logs on a side monitor, scrolling through the history. He whistled low. "Sir, this bird was scheduled for phase maintenance next week. It's been flying combat sorties for 8 months straight, over 200 flight hours beyond standard rotation." He looked up, his expression grim. The airframe was already fatigued before it took a missile hit. Katsaros didn't respond. There was nothing to say. They were beyond maintenance schedules now, beyond standard operating procedures. They were in the realm where physics and will collided, where training met raw survival instinct. Outside, the sun had fully cleared the mountains, painting the runway in harsh golden light. The dust was worse now, whipped up by the morning thermals, reducing visibility to something barely adequate. The major could see the heat shimmer already rising from the concrete, those treacherous currents that could slam an aircraft into the ground without warning. His headset crackled. "Nightingale, Viper 7-1. I'm 5 miles out beginning final approach. I have the field in sight." There in the distance, a dark speck against the pale morning sky. Even from this distance, Katsaros could see the irregular silhouette, the asymmetric profile of an aircraft that had no business still flying. The emergency frequency filled with controlled chaos as fire crews confirmed positions, as the crash medical team reported ready, as every element of the base's emergency response aligned for what came next. The major picked up the handset for the direct line to the fire chief. "Chief, based on her damage, she's going to be heavy on one side. If she loses it on rollout, be ready for a ground loop, but don't approach until she's fully stopped and we confirm no fire." "Understood, Control." We've got her. Through the tower windows, Katsaros watched the speck grow larger, and he began to see the full extent of the damage. The left side of the aircraft was scorched black, metal peeled back like flower petals. The remaining engine screamed as Kovac adjusted power, the sound carrying clearly across the distance, a wounded mechanical howl. The approach was textbook perfect. Whatever was broken, whatever systems had failed, Kovac was compensating with pure skill. The nose angle was exact, the rate of descent steady, the wing level discipline absolute despite the asymmetric thrust. She was 3 miles out when the tower controller spoke, his voice deliberately calm. Viper 7-1 Nightingale Tower, wind check 270 at 20 gusting 28. Runway is yours, you are cleared to land. Cleared to land, Viper 7-1. 2 miles. The Major could see it clearly now through binoculars. The landing gear was down, but the left main appeared damaged, cocked at a wrong angle. The nose gear looked intact. The canopy was smoke-stained but unbroken, and still that impossible aircraft flew, held aloft by thrust and will, and the stubborn refusal to acknowledge that it was already dead. 1 mile. The master sergeant began counting altitude under his breath. 500 feet, 400, 350, she's high. He was right. The approach was slightly high, possibly because Kovac didn't trust the damaged aircraft to respond if she went low and had to add power. Better to come in high and bleed off speed, even if it meant eating up precious runway. 300 feet, 250, crossing the threshold now. The A-10 flashed over the approach end of the runway, and Katsaros could see the extent of the damage with nauseating clarity. The entire left side was destroyed, barely recognizable as part of an aircraft. How it was generating any lift at all was a mystery that would keep aeronautical engineers arguing for years. Kovac flared perfectly, the nose rising as she bled off speed, the rate of descent decreasing as she transitioned from flying machine to falling object under control. The right main tire kissed the concrete first, a puff of white smoke. The nose gear followed an instant later. Then the damaged left main made contact and everything happened at once. The weakened strut collapsed immediately, the left wing dropping toward the concrete as the aircraft skewed sideways. The right wing lifted as the plane began the dreaded ground loop, that uncontrollable spin that destroys aircraft and kills pilots. In the tower, every person held their breath. Kovac must have felt the collapse through the control stick, must have known in that instant that she was about to die. The aircraft would cartwheel, the fuel would ignite, and the cockpit would disintegrate. Standard procedure said there was nothing to be done, but Captain Myra Kovac wasn't interested in standard procedure. She stood on the right brake with everything she had, simultaneously cutting the throttle and dropping the flaps asymmetrically, doing a dozen things that the manual said would tear the aircraft apart, but which, in this specific moment of chaos, created just enough counterforce to arrest the spin. The A-10 shuddered, groaned, and slewed to a stop in a shower of sparks and shredded metal, pointing 30 degrees off the runway centerline, its left wing tip resting on concrete, fuel streaming from ruptured tanks. But it was stopped, and it wasn't on fire. The emergency crews were moving before the dust settled, foam already spraying, silver-suited firefighters approaching from upwind. The Major's voice was steady on the radio. Viper 7-1, Nightingale Control. Shut down all systems and evacuate the aircraft immediately. The canopy popped open with a sharp crack of explosive bolts. A figure in a flight suit emerged, moving with the careful precision of someone who knew exactly how close they'd come to dying. Captain Kovac climbed down from the cockpit, walked 3 steps away from the wreckage, and only then did her knees buckle slightly. A firefighter caught her, helped her the rest of the way to safety as the foam continued to spray, as the emergency crews swarmed the broken aircraft, as the entire base seemed to exhale collectively. In the tower, Major Katsaros set down his headset with hands that trembled slightly. The base commander was already on the phone with higher headquarters, his voice carefully neutral as he reported the incident. The senior controller was pulling the radar tape for the inevitable investigation. But the Major was watching the distant figure of Kovac, now surrounded by medics, still standing on her own feet, still alive. He thought about the 6 months she'd been assigned to this base, how she'd been almost invisible at first, always professional but never part of the inner circle of combat pilots. She was technically proficient, everyone acknowledged that, but there was something about her quiet competence that made the hotshots uncomfortable. She didn't brag, didn't compete for glory, didn't fit the mold of what they expected from a fighter pilot. Her call sign of Viper had been meant affectionately, but there had been an undercurrent to it, a suggestion that she was cold, calculating, dangerous in ways that made her colleagues nervous. Now, watching the wreckage of an aircraft that should have killed her, watching the impossible landing that had defied every probability, Katsaros understood. Viper wasn't about being cold. It was about striking with precision from impossible angles. It was about surviving when survival seemed impossible. It was about that moment when everyone else had given up, when the math said you were already dead and you found one more move, one more option, one more way through. The phone on his console rang. He picked it up to find the wing commander's voice, sharp and demanding. Katsaros, I'm watching the footage. Tell me how that aircraft is in one piece. The major looked at the broken A-10, at the foam still spraying, at the fire crews who were now standing down as it became clear there would be no conflagration. Sir, I honestly couldn't tell you. By every metric I know, that aircraft should have come apart in the air. And the pilot, tell me about her. Katsaros pulled up Kovach's personnel file on his screen. The details were sparse, professional, unremarkable at first glance. But he read between the lines now, saw what he'd missed before. The flight instructor ratings, the emergency procedures certifications, the quiet accumulation of experience that didn't shout for attention but built capability brick by careful brick. Sir, Captain Myra Kovach, 6 years active duty, transitioned from helicopters to fixed-wing 3 years ago. Above average marks across the board but never top of her class. Instructor qualified in 3 platforms. Her evaluation reports use words like steady, reliable, methodical. He paused, watching the distant figure still standing despite everything. I think we've been underestimating her, sir. The wing commander was silent for a moment. I think you're right. When she's cleared by medical, I want her in my office. And Katsaros, make sure everyone who saw that landing understands they witnessed something exceptional. That's the kind of airmanship that needs to be studied, understood, remembered. The major hung up and walked to the tower windows. Below, the routine of the base was slowly resuming, aircraft beginning to move again, the emergency now contained. But something had changed in those few minutes of impossible flight. The senior controller appeared at his elbow, holding a coffee that had gone cold during the emergency. Sir, I've been doing this job for 22 years. I've never seen anything like that. Katsaros accepted the coffee, took a sip despite the temperature. Neither have I, Chief. Neither have I. The base hospital was organized chaos when Kovach arrived, still in her flight suit, still covered in hydraulic fluid and smoke residue. The medics wanted to run a full battery of tests, checking for everything from chemical exposure to spinal trauma. She endured their ministrations with patient silence, answering questions about pain levels and vision clarity while her mind remained partially back in that cockpit, still calculating angles and fuel rates and structural stress tolerances. The flight surgeon, a captain named Tors who'd seen his share of combat injuries, examined her with careful attention. Physically, she was remarkably unscathed. A few bruises from the harness, minor chemical burns on her hands where she'd handled damaged controls, elevated stress markers in her bloodwork. Nothing that wouldn't heal. But Tors had been doing this long enough to know that the body wasn't the whole story. "How are you feeling, Captain?" he asked, keeping his voice neutral. Kovach looked at him with those steady gray eyes that had become slightly famous in the last hour as footage of the landing circulated through the base. Tired, ready for coffee and a shower, preferably in that order. No tremors, no anxiety, no intrusive thoughts about the incident. She considered the question seriously, didn't offer a dismissive response. My hands are steady. My thoughts are clear. I know I'll probably have some delayed reaction once the adrenaline fully metabolizes, but right now I'm fine. Tors made notes in her chart. I'm clearing you for duty with a mandatory 72-hour stand-down. No flying, no duty shifts. Sleep, process, and come back when you're ready. And Captain, he looked up from his tablet, that was some of the finest flying I've ever heard of. Kavech nodded acknowledgement but didn't smile. She wasn't being cold, Tors realized, just efficient. She'd already moved on to the next thing, already processing what needed to be done. By the time she left the hospital, still in her flight suit because someone had already taken her damaged gear for analysis, the story had spread beyond the base. Combat camera footage of the landing was being reviewed at headquarters. Satellite imagery was being analyzed. Engineers were already descending on the wreckage, eager to understand how it had survived. But Kavech wasn't thinking about any of that. She was thinking about the 37 seconds between the missile strike and the moment she'd regained control, those eternal seconds of falling through Afghan mountains with an aircraft that was actively disintegrating, when every instinct had screamed at her to eject, but something deeper, something trained and honed and absolutely certain, had whispered that there was still a chance. She'd taken that chance. The debriefing room was small, windowless, and utterly professional. Major Katsaros sat across from her, a recorder running on the table between them, and walked her through every moment of the mission. She described the target area, the ground support mission for a reconnaissance unit, the routine patrol that had suddenly become anything but routine. The missile launch was from my 7 o'clock low, she said, her voice steady and technical. Surface to air, probably a MANPAD based on the signature. I initiated defensive maneuvers, but the closure rate was too high. Impact was to the left engine at 12,300 feet. Katsaros made notes but mostly just listened. This was her story, her moment. He was just the recorder of history now. I felt the control loss immediately. The aircraft rolled inverted and entered a spin. All standard emergency procedures indicated ejection was mandatory. She paused, and for the first time something flickered behind those gray eyes. Not fear exactly, but acknowledgement of the enormity of what she'd done. I didn't eject. Why not? The question was gentle, curious, not accusatory. Kavech was silent for a long moment, and when she spoke, it was with careful precision, as if she was only now understanding her own reasoning. Because I could still feel the stick responding. Not much, maybe 20% control authority, but something. And I thought about the reconnaissance unit on the ground, about how they were depending on air support, about how if I ejected, they'd be alone for at least 30 minutes until another bird could arrive. She met the Major's eyes. So I decided to see if I could save the aircraft. Worst case, I'd eject lower. Best case, I'd get back to base and the bird could fly another mission. It was the kind of calculation that should have been impossible in the chaos of a dying aircraft. But Katsaros was beginning to understand that Captain Myra Kavech didn't think like other pilots. She didn't fly on instinct and bravado. She flew on mathematics and cold probability, on the ruthless elimination of emotion in favor of optimal outcomes. She was, he realized, exactly the kind of pilot you wanted in a crisis. But also exactly the kind of pilot who made other pilots uncomfortable, because she didn't fit their mental model of what heroism looked like. "Talk me through the recovery," he prompted. She did, in exacting detail. The way she'd used the asymmetric thrust to arrest the spin, trading altitude for control. The way she'd navigated through the canyon using terrain masking, keeping the damaged side away from potential ground fire. The constant recalculation of fuel states, of glide ratios, of minimum safe altitudes. It was a technical masterpiece, and Katsaros found himself taking notes not just for the incident report but for training purposes. This was airmanship at a level that needed to be taught, studied, immortalized. When the debriefing finally ended 3 hours later, Kavech stood to leave, but the Major stopped her with a gesture. "Captain, I need you to understand something. What you did today was extraordinary. Not just the technical skill, though that was remarkable, but the decision-making, the composure under pressure, the refusal to give up when giving up was the reasonable option." He paused. "That's the kind of flying that defines a career that becomes legend. You saved a multi-million-dollar aircraft, you saved yourself, and you got back to base to support your mission. That matters." Kavach nodded slowly. "Thank you, sir, but I was just doing my job." It was the kind of modest response that should have seemed false, but somehow with her, it rang true. She wasn't being humble for show. She genuinely believed she'd just executed her training as designed, that anyone in her position would have done the same. Major Katsaros knew better. Most pilots would have ejected the moment they felt that first violent roll. They would have followed procedure, would have prioritized their own survival, and no one would have blamed them. It was what they were trained to do. But Kavach had seen past the procedure to the outcome, had made a split-second calculation that the risk was worth the reward, and had possessed the skill to back up that calculation with action. That was rare. That was special. That was the difference between a good pilot and an exceptional one. She left the debriefing room and walked across the base in the late afternoon sun, still in her flight suit, ignoring the stares and whispers that followed her. She needed that shower, that coffee, and about 12 hours of sleep. But first, she detoured past the flight line, past the maintenance hangars, to where her A-10 sat surrounded by engineers and accident investigators. The aircraft looked even worse up close. The left engine was completely gone, just a charred cavity. The tail section hung by a few stressed structural members. The left wing had multiple holes, edges peeled back by forces that should have torn it off entirely. Yet it had flown. It had carried her home. One of the engineers looked up as she approached, his expression a mixture of awe and disbelief. "Captain Kavach, we're trying to understand how this thing stayed together. The stress analysis says it should have failed at 3 different points during your recovery. The only explanation is that you were keeping it together through control inputs, compensating for structural damage in real time." She studied the wreckage, seeing in her mind's eye how it had looked from the cockpit, how each shudder and groan had told her something about what was failing and what was holding. "It wanted to fly," she said simply. "I just gave it the opportunity." The engineer shook his head. "Ma'am, with all respect, aircraft don't want anything. This is physics and metallurgy. And according to physics and metallurgy, you're standing in front of a crash site, not a landed aircraft." Kavach allowed herself a small smile, the first one anyone had seen since the incident. "Then I guess we found the edge of what physics and metallurgy know. You might want to recalculate your models." She walked away, leaving the engineer staring after her, already pulling out his tablet to make notes. That night in her small quarters on base, Kavach finally allowed herself to process what had happened. She sat on the edge of her bunk, still in flight suit pants and a t-shirt, and let her hands shake. They'd been steady all day, through the emergency, through the landing, through the debriefing. But now, in privacy, her body finally acknowledged the proximity of death. She'd come within seconds of dying, and she knew it. The missile had been closer than she'd admitted in the debriefing. The control loss had been more severe than she'd described. There had been a moment, falling through that Afghan sky with a broken aircraft, when she'd reached for the ejection handle and her hand had hovered there, and she'd made a choice that defied training and common sense. She'd chosen to stay with the aircraft. Not because she was brave, though that's how others would describe it. Not because she was skilled, though she was, but because in that moment of absolute clarity that comes when death is immediate, she'd realized something fundamental about herself. She was a pilot. Not someone who flew aircraft, but someone whose identity was bound up in the marriage of human and machine, in the act of taking something mechanical and making it dance, making it sing, making it do things that shouldn't be possible. The aircraft had been damaged but alive, and she'd refused to abandon it while it could still fight. That connection, that refusal to quit while there was still thrust and lift and control, that was what made her different. She wasn't sure it made her better, but it definitely made her different. Her phone buzzed with a text message from her squadron commander. "Wing commander wants to see you at 800 tomorrow. Bring coffee, this will take a while. Major Chen." She typed a quick acknowledgement and set the phone aside. Tomorrow would bring commendations, probably media attention, definitely questions from people who wanted to understand how she'd done what she'd done. But tonight was hers, this quiet moment of recognition that she'd been tested at the ultimate level and had not been found wanting. She lay back on the bunk and closed her eyes, and in her mind's eye she flew again. Not the emergency, Not the damaged aircraft, but the perfect flight that existed in every pilot's imagination, where the machine responded instantly to thought, where the sky opened up infinite and welcoming, where there was nothing but the present moment and the joy of controlled flight. Tomorrow she'd be a hero, whether she wanted the label or not. But tonight, she was just Viper, and that was enough. The morning brought attention she'd never sought but couldn't avoid. The wing commander's office was spacious by military standards, with windows overlooking the flight line where aircraft moved with purposeful precision. Colonel Stravinsky was a veteran of 3 wars, a pilot's pilot who'd flown everything from fighters to heavies, and he studied Kovacs with the careful attention of someone evaluating an unexpected asset. "Sit down, Captain. Coffee's on the table, help yourself." She poured a cup, black, and settled into the chair across from his desk. The colonel didn't waste time on pleasantries. "I've reviewed the footage, read the preliminary reports, and spoken with everyone involved in yesterday's emergency. I've also fielded calls from 3 different generals, 2 news networks, and the public affairs office, all wanting to know about you." He leaned back in his chair. "So I'm going to ask you directly, how much of yesterday was skill and how much was luck?" It was a fair question, and Kovacs appreciated that he'd asked it privately rather than in front of others. "Sir, I'd estimate 70% skill, 30% luck. I had enough control authority to execute the recovery, but there were structural factors I couldn't see or predict. The fact that the wing didn't separate during the dive was luck. Getting it back to base was skill." Stravinsky nodded. "That's honest. Now, second question. The recognition for this is coming whether you want it or not. How do you want to handle it?" She'd been thinking about this since she'd woken up. "Sir, I'd prefer minimal public exposure. I'm not comfortable being anyone's poster child. But I understand the Air Force will need to use this for recruiting and morale purposes, so I'll do whatever's required." That's the right answer, but I'm going to push back slightly. The colonel pulled out a tablet and turned it to face her. "This is the preliminary analysis from the Mishap Investigation Board. They're calling your performance unprecedented and a demonstration of airmanship that represents the highest standards of the service. The Chief of Staff's office wants to award you the Distinguished Flying Cross." Kovacs' expression didn't change, but something flickered in her eyes. The DFC was serious, a medal given for heroism or extraordinary achievement in aerial flight. It was the kind of recognition that changed careers. "Sir, I appreciate the consideration, but I was doing my job. I don't need recognition for executing my training." "Captain, you're missing the point." Stravinsky's voice was gentle but firm. "This isn't about you needing recognition. This is about the service needing examples of excellence. Do you know how many young pilots will watch footage of that landing and think, 'That's what I want to be'? Do you know how many commanders will use your decision-making as a teaching tool?" He paused. "You don't get to decide if you're a role model. That decision was made the moment you pulled off an impossible recovery. The only choice you have is whether you're going to embrace it or resist it." She absorbed this in silence, processing. Finally, she nodded. "Then I'll embrace it, sir. But I have one request." "Name it." "When they write up the story, when they talk about what happened, I want the focus on the training, on the procedures that gave me the tools to attempt the recovery. I didn't invent any new techniques yesterday. I applied what I'd been taught, just in a novel situation." Stravinsky smiled, and it was approving. "That's exactly the right attitude. Consider it done." He stood, signaling the meeting was ending. "You're grounded for 72 hours per medical, but after that, I want you back in the rotation. We need pilots who can think under pressure, and you've proven you can do exactly that." The Distinguished Flying Cross ceremony took place 3 weeks later, on the same flight line where Kovacs had landed the destroyed. The aircraft itself sat in the background, preserved now as evidence and soon to be displayed as a teaching tool, its shattered form a testimony to violence survived. The base personnel formed up in parade formation, hundreds of airmen in dress blues standing at attention under a sky that was mercilessly clear. Generals flew in for the occasion. Media cameras rolled. It was everything Kovacs had never wanted, but she stood at attention, her uniform perfect, and received the medal with quiet dignity. The citation was read aloud, detailing her actions with the dry precision of official military language. But Major Katsaros, standing in the crowd, thought the words missed the essential truth. They talked about skill and courage, about technical proficiency and mission success. All true, all important. But they didn't capture that moment in the tower when the radar had shown an impossible blip, when a voice had spoken with impossible calm, when everyone had witnessed the emergence of something rare. They didn't capture the moment when Viper had transformed from a call sign into a legend. After the ceremony, there was a reception. Pilots from across the base came to congratulate her, to shake her hand, to ask careful questions about technique and decision-making. She answered them all with patience, turning every question into a teaching moment, deflecting praise back to training and preparation. But Katsaros noticed something else. The younger pilots, especially the women, looked at Kovacs with something approaching reverence. In an air force that was still predominantly male, still struggling with questions of equality and opportunity, she became something powerful. Not through speeches or activism, but through pure competence. She'd been tested at the absolute limit and had prevailed. That mattered. A young lieutenant, fresh from flight school, approached with nervous energy. "Captain Kovacs, I just wanted to say, watching the footage of your landing changed how I think about flying. The way you never gave up, the way you found solutions when there shouldn't have been any solutions." She trailed off, starstruck. Kovacs looked at the lieutenant with those steady gray eyes. "What's your name?" "Lieutenant Morrison, ma'am. I just got certified on A-10s last month." "Then let me tell you something, Lieutenant. That landing wasn't about never giving up. It was about honestly assessing what was possible at every moment. There were several points where ejection would have been the right call. I stayed with the aircraft because the math said I could, not because of stubbornness. The lesson isn't never quit. The lesson is know your aircraft, know yourself, and make the best decision you can with the information available. Sometimes that means staying with a damaged bird. Sometimes it means punching out. The skill is knowing which is which." Morrison absorbed this, nodding seriously. "How do you learn that, ma'am? How do you develop that judgment?" "Hours," Kovacs said simply. "Hours in the cockpit, hours studying systems, hours reviewing mishap reports and learning from other people's mistakes. There's no shortcut. You build judgment brick by brick, flight by flight, until the moment something goes wrong and you discover you've already seen something similar, already thought through the problem, already developed the instincts you need." It was the most Kovacs had said in public since the incident, and people nearby were listening, recording her words on phones, committing them to memory. She was becoming what Colonel Stravinsky had predicted, a teaching tool, a standard of excellence. As the reception wound down and people began drifting away, Kovacs found herself standing alone near the wreckage of her A-10. The setting sun painted it in shades of gold and amber, softening the harsh reality of torn metal and burnt components. It looked almost beautiful in the way that broken things sometimes do. "Penny for your thoughts." Major Katsaros had approached quietly, 2 beers in hand. He offered her one. She accepted, taking a long drink before answering. "I'm thinking about how strange it is that the worst moment of my career is also going to define my career. That 30 minutes of emergency is going to overshadow everything else I ever do." "Does that bother you?" "I'm not sure yet," she admitted. "Part of me wants to just be a regular pilot, fly my missions, do my job without all this attention. But another part recognizes that this is an opportunity to influence how people think about flying, about decision-making under pressure." They stood in comfortable silence, watching the sun sink lower, painting the mountains in layers of purple and gold. Finally, Katsaros spoke. "For what it's worth, I think you're handling this better than most would. You're staying humble without being falsely modest. You're accepting the recognition without letting it inflate your ego. That's a hard balance." "I had a good instructor once," Kovacs said, "back in flight school. She told me that the moment you start believing your own hype is the moment you stop improving. So I'm trying not to believe the hype, even though everyone's very kind." "That's wisdom." Katsaros finished his beer. "You know, when I authorized your call sign, I thought it was clever, the Viper that strikes from unexpected angles. I had no idea how literal it would become." Kovacs smiled, a real smile this time. "Neither did I, sir. Neither did I." The weeks that followed brought a strange new reality. Kavach returned to flight status, flying the same missions she'd flown before, but everything was different now. Other pilots treated her with a mixture of respect and awe. Ground crews requested her autograph. Air traffic controllers recognized her voice on the radio and gave her priority handling even when she didn't need it. It was uncomfortable, this celebrity. She joined the Air Force to fly, not to be famous. But she adapted, as she adapted to everything, by breaking the problem into manageable components. She set boundaries about media access, gave interviews when required, but kept them focused on safety and training rather than personality. She volunteered as an instructor, sharing her knowledge with younger pilots who were eager to learn. And she flew. Every chance she got, she took to the air, not in damaged aircraft this time, but in perfectly functional machines, and she reminded herself why she'd chosen this life. The freedom of 3 dimensions, the technical challenge of managing complex systems, the satisfaction of executing a perfect approach or a flawless weapons delivery. The flying was what mattered. The rest was just noise. 6 months after the incident, the Air Force published a detailed case study of her emergency recovery, complete with flight data analysis, structural stress calculations, and recommendations for training modifications. It became required reading at the Air Force Weapons School, studied by the best pilots in the service. Kavach read it herself, curiously, seeing her own actions dissected and analyzed by engineers and tacticians. They'd identified 17 specific moments where her inputs had prevented catastrophic failure, 11 instances where standard procedure would have resulted in loss of the aircraft, and 4 points where ejection would have been justified but she'd chosen to continue. Reading it was strange, like watching herself from outside, seeing the emergency as a clinical sequence of problems and solutions rather than the visceral experience of falling through the sky in a broken machine. But it was also validating. The analysis confirmed what she'd felt instinctively during the crisis, that there had been a path through, narrow and demanding but real. She hadn't been lucky. She'd been skilled, and the skill had been sufficient. That mattered. The Distinguished Flying Cross sat in a case on her desk, next to her few other personal items. She didn't display it prominently, but she didn't hide it either. It was a marker, a waypoint in her career that acknowledged she'd been tested and had measured up. The Air Force Times ran a feature article about her, complete with photos and interviews with her squadron mates. They talked about her methodical approach to flying, her encyclopedic knowledge of aircraft systems, her calm in emergencies. One pilot was quoted saying, "You want Viper on your wing. She's not flashy, but she's solid. She's the person you want there when things go sideways." It was exactly the reputation Kavach had built deliberately over her career. Not the hotshot, not the ace, but the steady professional who could be trusted when it mattered most. The emergency had simply revealed what was already there, pulling back the curtain on capabilities she'd been quietly developing for years. But there was one aspect of the attention that she hadn't anticipated, one consequence that caught her off guard. She started receiving letters from young women, teenagers mostly, who'd heard about her story and wanted to know how to become pilots. They wrote about their dreams, their doubts, their fears that they weren't good enough or tough enough or confident enough. Kavach read every letter. She responded to as many as she could, her advice consistent and practical. Study mathematics and physics. Take care of your physical fitness. Learn to stay calm under pressure. Build your skills systematically, brick by brick, until you're so competent that your gender becomes irrelevant. Don't try to prove you're as good as the men. Just be so undeniably skilled that comparisons become meaningless. It was advice she'd lived by, and it had worked. Not perfectly, not without challenges, but well enough that she'd achieved her goal of flying combat aircraft for the United States Air Force. If she could help others do the same, that was worth the discomfort of public attention. A year after the incident, the Air Force held a ceremony to formally retire the damaged A-10 and move it to a museum. The aircraft had been cleaned, stabilized, and prepared for permanent display. its battle damage carefully preserved as evidence of what it had survived. Kavach attended the ceremony, along with Major Katsaros, now promoted to lieutenant colonel, and many of the personnel who'd been involved in the emergency. The aircraft looked strangely peaceful in the museum hangar, lit by soft spotlights that emphasized its scars. A plaque nearby told the story in brief clinical terms, ending with the phrase flown by Captain Myra Kavach in an extraordinary demonstration of airmanship and determination. Standing before it, Kavach was struck by how small it looked. In her memory, the aircraft was huge, a massive wounded beast that she'd barely been able to control. But here, surrounded by other exhibits, it was just one more machine, remarkable for its damage but not unusual in its basic form. Thousands of A-10s had flown thousands of missions. This one just happened to have an interesting story. "How does it feel?" Katsaros asked quietly, seeing it here. "Strange," she admitted. "Like looking at a photograph of yourself and not quite recognizing the person in the image. I know that's the aircraft I flew, I know those are the same scars, but it feels disconnected from the experience somehow." "That's because you've moved on," he suggested. "The emergency was a moment in time, intense and significant, but just a moment. You've flown dozens of missions since then, accumulated hundreds more hours, continued building your career. The aircraft is frozen in that moment, but you've kept growing." It was an insightful observation, and Kavach nodded slowly. "I suppose that's true. I'm not the same pilot I was a year ago. The emergency taught me things I couldn't have learned any other way, but it didn't define me. I'm still learning, still improving." "That's exactly the right attitude," Katsaros said. "The worst thing that could happen would be if you let that one moment become your ceiling, if you decided you'd peaked and there was nowhere else to go. Instead, you've used it as a foundation. That's the difference between a flash in the pan and a sustained career of excellence." The ceremony concluded with speeches from senior officers, praise for Kavach's actions, and recognition of the maintainers and support personnel who'd kept the aircraft flying through 8 months of intensive combat operations before the emergency. It was appropriate, Kavach thought, that they were recognized. An aircraft was never just one pilot's responsibility. It was the product of dozens of people's expertise, and her successful landing had depended on the maintainers who'd kept critical systems functional despite the aircraft's age and operational tempo. After the ceremony, she was approached by a group of cadets from the Air Force Academy, visiting the museum as part of their training. They asked the expected questions about the emergency, about her decision-making process, about how she'd stayed calm. She answered patiently but then turned the conversation. "Let me ask you something," she said to the cadets. "Why do you want to be pilots?" They offered various answers: the thrill of flying, the desire to serve, the technical challenge, the prestige of wearing wings, all valid reasons, all part of why people chose this career. Kavach listened and then nodded. "All good answers. But let me tell you what I've learned. The reason you start flying isn't as important as the reason you keep flying, because there will be days when it's not thrilling, when it's just hard work and fatigue and routine. There will be moments of boredom punctuated by seconds of terror. There will be times when you question whether it's worth it." She paused, choosing her words carefully. "What keeps you going through those times is a deeper reason, something beyond excitement or prestige. For me, it's the satisfaction of mastery, of taking something complex and making it look easy. It's the knowledge that I'm protecting people on the ground who depend on air support. It's the quiet pride of doing a difficult job well." The cadets absorbed this seriously. One of them, a young woman with sharp eyes and a determined expression, asked, "Captain, do you ever get scared?" "Every flight," Kavach answered honestly. "Fear isn't the enemy. Panic is the enemy. Fear keeps you sharp, makes you check your systems twice, reminds you that what we do is dangerous and demands respect. The goal isn't to eliminate fear. It's to function effectively despite fear." The young woman nodded, and Kavach saw something in her expression that reminded her of herself years ago, that mixture of determination and uncertainty, confidence and doubt. She made a mental note to remember the cadet's name. In a few years, when that cadet earned her wings, Kavach wanted to follow her career, wanted to see if the determination translated into skill. 2 years after the emergency, Kovacs was promoted to major and given command of her own squadron. It was a natural progression, recognition not just of the emergency but of sustained excellence over her entire career. She accepted the promotion with the same quiet competence she brought to everything and set about the work of leadership. Command was different from flying. The technical challenges were replaced by human challenges, the mathematics of flight giving way to the complexities of motivation, training, and unit cohesion. She discovered she had a talent for it, the same methodical approach that made her a good pilot translating well to leadership. She built her squadron systematically, identifying weak points and strengthening them, recognizing talent and nurturing it, setting standards and holding everyone, including herself, to them. Under her command, the squadron's readiness ratings climbed. Their mishap rate dropped to 0. Younger pilots sought transfers to serve under her, knowing she'd make them better. The emergency that had made her famous was now just one line in her official biography, important but not defining. She'd moved beyond it, had proven that she was more than one moment of drama. She was a consistently excellent officer, and that excellence was earning recognition on its own merits. 3 years after the emergency, Kovacs was invited to speak at the Air Force Weapons School graduation. It was a significant honor, a recognition that she'd reached the tier of pilots whose opinions mattered, whose experiences were worth studying. She accepted, though not without some trepidation. Public speaking had never been her strength, but she prepared carefully, drafting her remarks with the same attention to detail she brought to mission planning. On the day of the graduation, she stood before a class of the Air Force's elite pilots, men and women who just completed the most demanding